In this book, Peter Turchin claims to have discovered some key principles in the development of human societies. The most important are two surrounding the creation of empires. First, they are created on ethnic frontiers, and second, empires are created by societies that have developed internal solidarity. These are not his only points. For example, he also talks about cycles of a century and another cycle of about 30 years, but most of his argument centers around the creation of empires, so that is what I will focus on. The first point is that empires arise on ethnic frontiers. He actually calls them meta-ethnic to emphasize that the frontiers must be more than just different peoples, but different civilizations. He emphasizes linguistic and religious differences. Many of his frontiers also seem to encompass a distinction between agriculturalist and pastoralist societies, which have long been known to be in conflict for a variety of reasons. Turchin does not emphasize this point, no doubt because it cannot be central to his thesis, as other frontiers do not include this distinction. Instead of solidarity, Turchin uses a term from the 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, asabiya. Turchin acknowledges that this is basically a translation and makes no case for why we should prefer the Arabic word, so I will use solidarity. Turchin uses this term to mean A. Different political entities cooperate or unite. B. People within a political entity cooperate. He spends a lot of time talking about how solidarity promotes military success. Thus, it isn't the horse archers of the Mongols that led to their victories, it is their solidarity. It isn't the English longbowmen that led to their victories over the French, it is their solidarity, or the lack of it on the part of the French. But in other cases, he says that solidarity doesn't lead to military victories. He mentions that the Romans lost a lot of battles, but won wars. So the exact role of solidarity in the creation of empires is not exactly clear. Some of the frontier examples he mentions are more convincing than others. Rome versus Gaul, Russia versus the Tatars makes sense. He mentions Spain versus the Arabs in the Iberian Peninsula, which definitely seems like a frontier that meets his criteria. On the other hand, the Muslims advanced into Spain in 711 and didn't get kicked out until 1492, a span of nearly 800 years. In another place, Turchin says that Gibbon's explanation for the decline of Rome over 1200 years is not convincing because of the great span of time. But is the rise of a state over 800 years any more convincing? And Spain never did fully unite. There were still 4 kingdoms when Granada was conquered. Readers might balk at whether Spain could be considered a multi-ethnic empire. Certainly nothing that happened among Christian states on the Iberian Peninsula prior to 1492 could be described as an empire. Instead, Turchin talks about their imperial accomplishments in the 16th century. Are we to believe that the Spanish kingdoms fought Islam for nearly 1,000 years and then suddenly attained sufficient coherence at the very end to become a world empire? Especially when the Muslim threat was so minor by the time that the conquest finally occurred. They had been reduced to a small part of the peninsula 200 years before and posed no danger to the conquest of the Christian kingdoms after that time. Turchin also mentions the rise of the Arabs, which he says were on the Byzantine-Persian frontier. But this is not really true. A look at the map shows that Mecca and Medina were well away from Byzantium and Persia, and they were not at war with either of them. They may have had some interaction with client states, but it is not true that Islam arose on a meta-ethnic frontier. It didn't even arise on a plain ethnic frontier. Muhammad's enemies were other Arabic tribes. Turchin just sweeps this under the rug. The most irritating thing about this book is the pseudo-scientific language that it is wrapped in. Turchin begins with Asimov's Foundation trilogy and its psychohistory, and makes various claims for the alleged scientific nature of his own investigations, even giving it a pseudo-scientific name, Cliodynamics, to separate it from all the previous unscientific investigations that historians have done. But we can't perform experiments on human societies, so we can't even begin creating science in the sense of physics, to which Turchin also appeals in a chapter where he compares our understanding of people to particles in physics. What he could do, at least, is to define his terms carefully, so that he could indicate what would be an example of an empire that arose in conditions contrary to the ones that he claims. There is no shame in having a thesis that does not work 100% of the time. In fact, when dealing with human societies, It would induce skepticism if a theory claimed to work even 90% of the time. But Turchin never provides parameters for falsifiability. Indeed, every empire that he studies miraculously seems to fit his paradigm. What he has done is to create some vague criteria that an enterprising researcher can interpret so as to fit any situation suitable. In other words, what he is doing is more like astrology than science. Here is an example of his special pleading. According to Turchin, every European state that emerged in the Middle Ages arose along an ethnic frontier. In the case of France, this was the frontier with Normandy, where the Vikings settled. On the one side, a Christian, Romance-speaking nation. On the other side, a pagan, Germanic-speaking one. Turchin admits that the Normans adopted Christianity and the French language within a century after settling Normandy. But, quote, even though they both now spoke similar dialects and professed the same religion, they thought of themselves as different and opposed groups, unquote. However, he treats the conversion of the Hungarians to Christianity very differently. Quote, Hungary became part of Latin Christendom, and even though the Hungarians and the Germans fought many wars after 1100 and mutual enemy lingered on all the way to the 19th century, a meta-ethnic divide no longer existed between the two nations. They now belonged to the same civilization. This, in spite of the fact that the supposed Latin Christian Hungarians continued to speak their own non-Indo-European language, even though the linguistic difference between the French and Vikings was considered a key factor in the existence of their frontier. There is one case, and one case only, where I find Turchin to admit that his thesis fails, the unification of Italy in the 19th century, as allegedly it did not have a meta-ethnic frontier to spur it. It requires an extremely ahistorical outlook to regard the unification of Italy as a surprising outcome, occurring as it did during the era of nationalism in Europe. Does Turchin really expect the same factors that led to the creation of Rome or the Arabic Caliphate to be operating within the society of European states in the 19th century? Turchin doesn't comment on the unification of Germany, but I'd like to know how he explains that, since it occurred near the same time and there was nothing remotely qualifying as a meta-ethnic frontier there, nor had there been for centuries. There is in fact a much better counterexample in Italy to Turchin's thesis. He begins the book talking about what he describes as the three greatest empires of world history, Russian, American, and Mongolian. But he leaves out another competitor for the status of greatest empire, the British. I can understand why he didn't want to mention it, though, because there is no conceivable way to fit Britain into his theory. It did not develop on anything like a meta-ethnic frontier, and moreover, it was characterized by class distinctions that undercut arguments about solidarity. In addition to its pseudoscientific patina, this book suffers from a large number of factual errors. I appreciate that in anything covering such a broad subject matter, some problems are likely to creep in, and they do not necessarily undermine the validity of its thesis. In this case, the number and flagrance of the problems is striking. I will mention just one that isn't even a factual error but a misspelling, but is so egregious that it calls attention to itself. Turchin spells Caucasus as Caucasus or Caucases at least half a dozen times over a few pages late in the book. This is not a single typo, but an array of misspellings that no reader could miss. If Turchin didn't know how to spell it, surely one of the readers would have caught it. Did the author insist on spelling it this way for some reason? If Turchin had written this book at the time of his hero, Ibn Khaldun, we would have praised it as a fascinating view of history. Today, we have higher expectations than individual scholars spinning out theories. Surely, you want to bring up likely objections to your ideas and counterexamples that don't fit your model. You don't have to address them all in detail, but as readers, we need to know that you are aware of them. A press only publishes a book after sending it out to independent readers, and we expect them to make appropriate criticisms and for the author to incorporate them into his work. It feels like that never happened for this book. As a reader, therefore, I feel like I've been given some interesting but thoroughly undigested ideas about history. The author has tried to sell his approach as a new scientific theory of history, but he has done nothing scientific with his ideas.